Hello, everybody. Today, in the US-China Public Dialogue series, we'll be discussing economic aspects of the China-US relationship with two great experts. From here in Washington, D.C., we'll have Dr. Yukon Huang. He's currently a senior fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. But in years gone by, he was the World Bank's country director for China. And from Beijing, actually from Shanghai, we'll have Mr. Weiwen, who's a senior fellow with the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University in Beijing. And he's also the vice chairman of the Global Alliance of Small and Medium Enterprises. Both these men have extensive experience and have written lots of great articles and books on China-US economic relations. And I'm Helena Cobban. I'm the president of Just World Educational, a small nonprofit headquartered in Virginia, but I'm currently working from Washington, D.C. Today's conversation is the second session in the 2020 US-China Public Dialogue project that Just World Educational is presenting in collaboration with the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies. Our partners at the Chongyang Institute will be releasing a Chinese language subtitled version of today's dialogue for audiences in China and worldwide, while we are releasing this English language version for audiences here in the United States and worldwide. And from our end, we're also archiving the English language version of these dialogue sessions in video, audio, and text formats on our website. And we're making available these records and a lot of related materials via a handy resource page on our website, www.justworldeducational.org. So do please check it out. We're also happy that the Global No Cold War Coalition is supporting this public dialogue effort. So now it's my pleasure to introduce my two guests. Dr. Yukon Huang, it's good to have you with us.
Pleasure to be here.
And our second guest from Shanghai is Mr. Weiwen. I'm so glad you can be with us too.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
So today, we'll be discussing 5 questions. For each question, I'll first give each guest a chance to provide a quick reply. Then, as time permits, I'll engage both of them in a short discussion before we move on to the next question. So the first question is, China and its economy have evidently started recovering from the effects of the COVID interruption, while the US economy, the world's largest, still seems mired in those effects. The IMF's latest World Economic Outlook forecast predicts that the US economy will contract by 4.3% in 2020, that China's will grow by 1.9%, but the economies of all or most other countries will see a significant contraction in 2020. This will hit low-income countries the hardest. What can the US and China do to help the low-income countries? So Dr. Yukon Huang, I'll turn to you first.
Thank you, Helena. Low-income countries are affected primarily through their trade and foreign investment links with the major powers. So when the world is in recession, this has a very negative effect on the low-income countries. What can the US, what can China do? It depends in part upon the nature of the recovery of these two countries. China's recovery, which is V-shaped, very, very strong, is largely driven by industrial exports, but its consumption response has been relatively slow. The US, and for that matter, Europe, their response has been driven largely by consumption, financed largely by government programs, social health programs, unemployment insurance, but their manufacturing response has been relatively slow. So on one hand, you have an industrial export response. On the other hand, you have a consumption response. What can China do? Well, China needs to actually support consumption because that's been lagging behind. And the only way that China can actually do this is frankly through more government support for social programs. And large amounts of this might be targeted toward what I would call the tens of millions of migrant workers in China who actually don't have unemployment insurance and who've suffered a lot. But if consumption in China can rebound, imports can rebound, and this will help the less developed countries. What can the U.S. do? And the major influence that the U.S. has is on world trade. And I think this is a very good time for America, for example, to basically put off what I call the punitive tariffs, which were launched during the trade war. Those tariffs have actually hurt everybody. It's even hurt U.S. manufacturers. And if you actually reduce those tariffs or got rid of them, it would facilitate world trade, and this would benefit the low-income countries. China's response is already benefiting many low-income countries in terms of increasing commodity prices, because many of these countries depend upon commodity prices. The last thing I would mention is about debt relief. Many low-income countries cannot afford to import more. They need to stimulate their own economies. There's a generalized debt relief program going on, which China is participating in. And I think for China to help facilitate debt relief, that would benefit low-income countries a lot. So let me stop there.
Well, those are some great suggestions. Mr. He, what could you suggest that the US and China could do to help the low-income countries?
Well, thank you. First of all, I would like to mention a little bit about the economic recovery in both China and the United States. There has been a clear time lag in the recovery between of the two countries, because China was hit first by COVID-19. So we saw a serious fall in economy during the first quarter of this year. With the GDP fell by 6.8% year on year. If we analyze that, that would be 27%. That is year on year. If we make it quarter to quarter, it will be over 30%, just as serious as that in the United States for the second quarter. After that, both China and the United States have been picking up their economy. However, China also faces difficulties, not as good as the years before COVID-19. So regarding the low-income economies, if we look at the IMF as the World Economic Outlook, the GDP fall in low-income economies will not be that serious. It's forecasted the total GDP for low-income countries will fall by only 1.2% in 2020, but will pick up quickly by 4.9%. So if we just say that it's okay, low-income economies are okay, then that will be misleading. We should pay more attention to the 4 points. First, both China and the United States should work together to research and develop the vaccines to control the virus. So that's very because the low-income people in low-income countries don't have enough financial resources and cannot afford to buy enough vaccine. So we should help develop the vaccine and make them public goods. Second, both China and United States should lower tariffs for those countries and encourage imports from them. Thirdly, we should also consider seriously about food aid if needed, because according to the United Nations Food Development Program, the people in hunger will be added. There will be another 130 million people added into those under hunger. So food aid should be ready in case of need. Fourthly, we should seriously work for the debt relief and including exemption and debt reschedule for those low-income countries. Thank you.
Well, I am really pleased to have heard so many things similar. You know, both of you are actually advocating ending tariffs or lowering tariffs and ramping up debt relief. So it strikes me there's a lot of things that you if it was just up to the two of you, then things could really move and get a lot better for the low-income countries. I'm going to move on to question 2 now. Sorry, we have to just keep moving along. Washington has for many decades tried to to shepherd global economic growth via the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and so on. Now China has founded what looks like a rival institution, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Can these two sets of institutions work together? Are they doomed to compete? Or might they in some way divide up the world between them? So now this time I'll go to Mr. He first.
Thank you. I think Dr. Huang is more in a position to say, to comment on this issue because he's an chief economist at the World Bank. To my understanding, as first, what is the Bretton Woods system? It's the core system is the world monetary system. It's the gold exchange standard. The dollar is pegged to the gold, and other currencies are pegged to dollar. But later, the dollar was delinked with gold, so they changed. So I think then after that, above that, there's IMF as an umbrella to keep a stable world monetary system. That's Bretton Woods system. And then it's a World Bank for reconstruction after World War II for the world. And then 2 years later, that's all happened in 1944 and came to be in the 1945. Then 2 years later, GATT was reached. So later GATT was added to the system. So 3 pillars, IMF, World Bank, and GATT, later WTO today. So regarding the AIIB, I think AIIB and World Bank are complementary rather than instead of being a rival, because we say that the purpose, objectives of World Bank is not only for infrastructure, it's for, they have 4 objectives. But since late 1990s, they are most focused on debt, on the poverty reduction. They cover 7 different areas, including infrastructure. And in the investment infrastructure, especially in Asia, the loan, the amount was limited. And World Bank plus Asia Development Bank loans for infrastructure investment per year was about 20 or $30 billion per year. Dr. Huang, please correct me if my number is incorrect. But the potential need for Asia in developed infrastructure is about $800 million per year, according to the estimate by OECD. So we need a supplement investor. So Asia Investment in Infrastructure Investment Bank was formed to supplement that. They can certainly cooperate because Asia AIIB follows the World Bank standards and cooperate with the World Bank. I remember that 1.5 years ago, on March 21st, 2019, and 2 presidents of AIIB and Asia Development Bank, Mr. Jin Lijing, Mr. Takehiko Nakao, had a meeting. They discussed on the cooperation, and both banks have a joint financial in 5 projects. So I think they are complementary instead of rival. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. Now, Dr. Huang, this is sort of your life's work practically, so love to hear your view on it.
Well, let me go back a couple of years when the AIIB was created. And we have to look at what the global situation is regarding these international financial institutions. You have the IMF, and it's generally run by a European. The World Bank is basically headed by a US official as president. You have the Asian Development Bank, whose president is generally Japanese. So I think the interesting point that China wanted to make was that as the 2nd largest economy, they would like to have an international agency in where their president was Chinese. And as Mr. He indicated, there was a need for infrastructure financing in Asia, and not enough projects could be financed by either the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank. But the concern at that time was whether or not a so-called AIIB would be a Chinese bank. that it would not follow what I would call global rules and precedents. But that was in fact a concern which was unfounded, because when the AIIB was created, many of the advisors, the people who designed the bank, they essentially came from the US, they came from Europe. They're on loan from the World Bank and Asian Development Bank. So the rules and regulations of AIIB are actually quite similar to the rules and regulations in the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. And it began in terms of financing by co-financing with the World Bank and the ADB. So they would share in terms of the financing and the design. And this ensured that there was collaboration between the AIIB and these other institutions. So I don't think this concern about splitting the world or creating two factions is realistic. There's one aspect of the AIIB that actually is not well known, and I think it's quite interesting. Today, there's more than 100 countries who are members of AIIB. The only two major economies which are not members is the US and Japan. Now, let me talk a little bit about the structure, the governance structure, which is interesting. The governance structure of the World Bank, the IMF, and the Asian Development Bank are such that the major shareholders have a voting veto-proof power. So America is guaranteed to be able to hold the chair as the president of the World Bank, similar for the IMF. The AIIB was actually created differently. It assumed that if everyone joined, including the US and Japan, China does not have a veto share. So AIIB is actually the only bank which, in theory, if America joined it, the president of AIIB would not have to be Chinese. And that's not true for the others. So rather than splitting the world apart, I think the AIIB offers an alternative model to say that these banks, they don't have to have a president who's a national of what I would call the leading member of that particular bank. And I think that's an interesting feature of the AIIB.
I did not know that. So that is really interesting. And it would be even more interesting if the US and Japan should join the effort to put the resources into developing Asian infrastructure. So now I'm going to come on to I think maybe what for me is the biggest question on our agenda today, and that is about decoupling regarding bilateral US-China relations. To what extent do each of you see a possibility of a substantial completion of the decoupling that has already been underway in recent years between our two economies? If you could address this at the levels of both trade and technology, the latter in light of the Huawei situation and similar situations. So this time, Dr. Huang, could you go first?
Thanks, Helena. Let's go back a year or so to the beginning of the US-China trade war. The US-China trade war is actually misnamed because it's really not about trade. It's really about technology transfer. It's actually about decoupling, as you mentioned. Trade is not really an issue. Global trade benefits both sides. The levying of punitive tariffs by the United States has led to higher prices for consumers and producers, both in America and abroad. So no one actually benefits from the tariffs. And we should actually be trying to promote trade, not to restrict it. But there is a concern. That concern is about foreign investment and a concern that China has a lot of restrictive practices, which actually makes foreigners, when they operate in China, they don't have what I call a level playing field. And I think that is a valid concern. China's been addressing this, I say, gradually over the last 4 or 5 years. They've been loosening up the restrictions in entry. They've been improving their courts dealing with intellectual property rights violations. They've been pledging that they would not force transfer of technology from foreign companies to Chinese companies. So I think there's a fair amount of progress, but it's going very slowly. So you need to address these in some way. But meanwhile, what's happening in the United States is that there is an impatience, and there's what I call increasing security concern. That security concern is that China is rapidly becoming more innovative. It's a threat to America's standing as the dominant global innovative power, high-tech power. And there's concerns that many products are dual use. They have both a commercial use, but there's also concern that they could have a security concern. And Huawei is the primary example. So Huawei is producing 5G communication systems. It has a very good system, it's cheaper, but there's a concern that this could be used for security concerns and it could not be regulated. So America has banned the use of Huawei domestically. America is basically encouraging other countries not to use Huawei. And Huawei is also being penalized by having reduced access to chips and other high-tech components produced in the United States. So let me focus upon Huawei as an example. The Huawei's products incorporate a huge variety of components which come from many countries. And many of these products, particularly chips, come from the United States. They also rely upon European products, Japanese products, products from Taiwan, Korea, globally. So when you actually restrict Huawei's access to these components, which America has been doing, this really jeopardizes Huawei's potential to expand or even to exist. So this, I think, is a major concern, and this is an example of the decoupling. But what is the impact of decoupling on the United States? Now, there are probably, I would say, 15 to 20 major high-tech American companies who basically earn 20 to 50% of their revenues from their exports to China. So when you cut off China as a market, you reduce the profitability of a wide range of US companies. In fact, these are America's most innovative companies, the most high-tech, sophisticated companies. So what is the consequence? Well, obviously, on Huawei, there's a negative consequence. And there are other companies being affected in China. But what people actually miss is the negative impact upon the US. So the IMF did a study a year ago on the impact of decoupling on China and on America. And it showed that China's growth rate could potentially decline by 1% or 2% because of this loss of high-tech components and inability to actually produce many of these goods. But America's economy would also be affected. In fact, America's economy growth rate would be cut in half because America depends upon innovation to prosper. So decoupling is a negative consequence for both sides. It's also affecting scholarly exchanges, information and research, even simple things like visas and tourism. And I think the ultimate consequence is the reduction in transfer of knowledge across borders. The world grows because knowledge is shared. And that's true domestically when we share it. It's true when we share it with other countries. So once you start to restrict the sharing of knowledge, you're reducing growth around the world. And we have a really serious problem. So how do you deal with this security issue? And I think there's only one way to deal with this, because you actually can't satisfy the issue of security. It's not an economic concern. My view would be you have to basically construct international global agreements to deal with these security concerns. You have to partner with each other. You have to have international regulatory agencies which can provide assurances to both sides that somehow these security concerns are being mitigated. So global collaboration, in my view, is the only way in the long term to solve what I call these security concerns, which are driving decoupling.
That is fascinating. And maybe if there's time, I'll come back on that. But first, we need to let Mr. He give his answer to the question about decoupling.
Well, thank you. I quite agree with Dr. Huang on the main points. I would like to add a few more. I think regarding decoupling, we can classify three different categories. First, the military products and technologies are always decoupled. Has always been decoupled. It's as guided by Cobban, Paris, and also Wasena arrangement. And the second category is the goods for general use, for consumption and the production. They have never been decoupled, or or have been reduced a little bit, but not substantial decoupling. For instance, we said that for the first 9 months of this year, according to China's customs data, China's export to the US was 3% higher than the same period of 2017, 3 years ago, before the trade war started. And if we just look at the computer electronics and electrical equipment and apparatus, we're seeing that for the year 2019, China was by far the largest supplier to the US. In computer and electronics, China accounted for 37.6% of total US imports, larger than number 2, number 3, and number 4 combined, namely Mexico, Malaysia, and Chinese Taiwan. And regarding the electrical equipment and components and apparatus, China accounted last year 31.6% of total US imports, equal that of the number 2, number 3, and number 4 combined, namely Mexico, Japan, and Germany. So that will not change fundamentally. And third category is high-tech, sensitive high-tech, dual use, and for the concern of the US national security, namely Huawei and virtually ban of semiconductors export to China, not only to Huawei, but to China in general. So what will that lead? If we go to that lead, I say that the world semiconductor market was about $480 billion in 2018. And the United States supplied 48%, not the final products, but the source. And China accounted for 18%. If there's a total ban of US supply to China semiconductors, then US global share will be reduced from 48 to 30%. And according to Boston consultants, then later in a few years, maybe Korea or China will become the largest supplier of the world's semiconductor, and the United States will be the second. So that will be bad for the US. And also say that we say that the top 10 US semiconductor producers all have a large dependence share on the China market. The Skyworks solution had 80% dependence, and Qualcomm had 63%, and Broadcom had 52%. Even Intel had 23%. So if China market is lost, they will cut serious to their revenue and to their inputs of research and development. That will be crucial for them, because the key for them to lead the world in the cutting edge technology is a huge input in R&D. So if that is lost, America will suffer serious. So I think the important thing is China, United States should talk, because the United States has no strategic confidence and trust in China, and nor does China have in the US. So we have to talk. And then not only the bilateral talk, we have to come into some agreement to avoid that worry. And also we should enter into multilateral agreement, because there's also some arrangement to guard against possible security concerns. And this should be one of the topics for the reform of WTO. And we should work together towards that instead of decoupling. Thank you.
I was really interested to hear both of you again, echoing many of the similar themes, namely the idea that the tariffs hurt everybody. I mean, as a consumer here in the United States, I know they hurt me, but they hurt a lot of people at all sections of the market. But what I was really interested in was this idea that you need some form of a global regulatory agency to deal with the potential security concerns over dual use items. And I mean, my background is much more in security studies than economic studies, but it strikes me that there's a sort of a parallel here with the International Atomic Energy Authority, the IAEA, which was set up precisely to provide a sort of UN-based regulatory framework in which countries could develop their nuclear capabilities, their nuclear power capabilities, nuclear medicine, all the many uses, specific uses that there are for nuclear research and production, with some form of supervising and monitoring and verification that these are not being diverted to military use. So it's not an exact parallel, but I think it is a worthwhile parallel to have out there, that you could have, as both of you mentioned, some form of an international regulatory framework for these security concerns around the development of technologies which, let's face it, I would love to have 5G. You know, here in Washington, DC, it would be wonderful. And people around the world need these technologies, but there are these security concerns. So anyway, thanks to both of you for contributing to that discussion so well. We're going to have to move on to question 4. And this is just about Chinese holdings of US debt, mainly. Professor Chongyang of the Shanghai University of Finance and Economics has recently said that China will decrease its holdings of US debt, but it might sell all of its US bonds in an extreme case like a military conflict. How realistic is each of these apparent threats? So this time it's Mr. He is.
Okay, thank you. This is an interesting question. I think this is only the personal comments, understanding of the professor. It's not the official position. I would like to make a few comments on China's on the holdings of the American treasury bills. We saw that for the past 6 months, there has been a net selling of US securities by many countries, not China only. According to the Treasury Department's data, up to the month August, during the past 6 months, the 6 months ending August, that means on the basis of compared with February, before the COVID-19 hit appeared. So the total world holdings of the US government official treasury the securities fell by 142.8 billion. And out of the total, China accounted for 24.3 billion, 17% of the total. And Japan also was cutting down 1.5 billion, not much. But in the month alone, August alone, Japan reduced 14.6 billion, very large. And China is just one of them. In February, China accounted for 15.1% of total foreign holdings of US securities. And in August, China's share remained 15.1%. So this also, China's selling has been almost the same tempo as other countries. So not particular China selling for some political purposes. No, I don't see that. The real reason is the concern for the mounting US government debt, which the total debt is $26 trillion, much higher than total GDP. And that's raised the concern for the possible sovereign debt default, although there has been no such a record since World War II. However, people have to concern about that. That's a god. And also, there's a decrease in yields of the US treasury bills. So people have to shift some of the reserves to some other financial products for better yields. That's normal. So whether China will sell all the securities in time of the military conflict, I don't know. For the time being, I think not only for the time being, for forever, our two countries should avoid any war. We should talk. We should handle our difference, no matter how great it is. Thank you.
Well, I think I really welcome that last comment of yours. Yeah, but I suppose we should think it's a possibility, but let's work to avoid it. So now, Dr. Huang, what do you think about China's holding of US debt and the risks involved?
Well, let me distinguish between two objectives. Why does China have US securities? Well, it comes from the fact that when you run a trade surplus, you have to hold your reserves in foreign currencies. It's either going to be in dollars, euros, yen, gold, or other forms. And then you basically hold less or more, in part to diversify. And today, there's also additional concern because many people are forecasting that the value of the dollar is going to be declining in the coming years. Because America's budget deficits are now so large that its trade surplus in the US is going to, trade deficit, for America is going to increase. And therefore, many people forecast a declining value of the dollar. And you can already see it. The renminbi has appreciated by 7% in the last 3 or 4 or 5 months. It's likely to continue to do so. So therefore, you basically decide that the dollar is going to decline. You might hold more euros, more yen, whatever, or more gold. That's one issue. But what I think the professor in Shanghai is referring to is what I call the nuclear option in terms of a trade war. That suppose America goes fully for decoupling. And even worse, suppose it bans or forbids China from trading and making use of the dollar in financing transactions. And that would, of course, cripple China's economy because it's so trade-oriented. So what could China do in response if there was a sanction? I'm talking about sanctions which America has levied on North Korea, on Iran, Iraq, basically saying, I forbid you to actually have access to America's foreign Federal Reserve System. And therefore, your trade relations are going to basically fall apart. That's the concern. And then the issue then is what can China do about it? So China then says, well, if that's the case, I'm going to withdraw my money from the US. I'm going to sell all my bonds that I've purchased. And the issue then is this potentially feasible? What is the consequence on that? And the answer is it's bad for both sides. Because if China decides to sell all its US bonds, it would drive down the value of the dollar and drive down the value of its holdings, so China would lose a large share of the value of its reserves, which are held in America. So what about on the US side? If China is no longer willing to buy US bonds, what's the consequence for America? And the consequence is interest rates in the US would soar because the government here in America is running huge deficits. It finances it by selling bills and bonds. If there's nobody willing to buy it, then the US government, instead of borrowing at 1% or 0.5%, ends up paying 4 or 5%. Essentially becomes financially impossible for America to fund its government deficits. So again, this is what I would call the nuclear option in terms of financial retaliation, that both sides would suffer a lot. And therefore, most people, when they look at this, feel that this is not a likely or reasonable possibility.
I see why you call it a nuclear option. And yet again, we have a parallel here. It's sort of mutually assured economic financial destruction, it sounds like. So again, something definitely to be avoided. So that brings us to the fifth question today. What steps, immediate and then long-term, do you think both countries' governments should take at the economic level to return to a more cooperative and mutually beneficial economic relationship? If possible, please look at steps your own country might take, as well as the other countries. So this time it's Dr. Huang's turn to go first.
Thank you. We have a problem in terms of US-China relations because there's confusion in terms of how each side looks at the other side. And if I were sitting in Beijing, which I often am because I write a lot about China, and I look at America's position regarding China, And I asked, what is it that Washington wants from China? And why is it so difficult to answer this question? Because there are actually what I call three constituencies in the US. There's the White House, President Trump. He's really fixated upon trade deficits. That's why he proposes these tariffs. He wants China to buy more, and that's what he's really concerned about. There's a second group. These are what I call US business community. They want better access to China's market. They want China to reform and liberalize. They want to actually invest more in China. So let me just point out that there's a contradiction here. Because if China actually liberalizes and reforms and more American companies go to China, this could actually lead to higher deficits because those companies produce more and they export back to the United States. So China has a bigger surplus, America has a bigger deficit. So this first constituency, the White House, American businesses, their goals are actually not necessarily complementary. Then you have what I call the third group. These are the foreign policy security people. And we just talked about them. They favor decoupling. They worry about China being a rising innovative power. They want to separate the two economies. Let's think about this group. Their views are the exact opposite of the US business community. The US business community actually wants to invest more in China. They want to integrate the two economies. But the security group wants to decouple the two economies. So you have a problem because these three groups represent US interests. And at any moment in time, their views may differ. And then China is difficult also. China wants to basically move up, become a more innovative economy. It wants to actually grow and has to deal with this US-China trade war. So in a practical sense, we have an election next week. If Biden wins, how will he be different? The Democratic Party is also quite negative in terms of its views of China. So there's actually not much difference between the Republicans and Democrats. But Biden, if he wins, would probably approach the issue differently because Biden favors forming alliances and having discussions to deal with these concerns. And I think that's a lot more productive than what I would call the chaotic decoupling approach of the White House today. So I think that potential Democratic taking over the White House could lead to more negotiations. What would be a good vehicle for beginning those negotiations on these issues that we've been discussing? And in fact, there is one. It's what I would call a bilateral investment treaty. It's not this US-China trade war or the trade truce. It's a bilateral investment treaty which would address many of these concerns of the US business communities or others who feel like the two economies could actually get along, but there are policy issues that need to be addressed. And under President Obama, agreement on a bilateral investment treaty was actually quite close. But when President Trump came into office, he actually put it to the side. Now, this process can be facilitated globally because Europe has exactly the same situation. They are currently negotiating a bilateral investment treaty between Europe and the United States. Now, these treaties, they actually address exactly many of these concerns that we've been talking about. And I think China is actually prepared to be responsive, but you need to have a dialogue and means for discussing this. So I would say a kind of collaborative discussion between Europe, US, China on some of these investment, foreign technology, decoupling kinds of issues is probably the best means of actually getting the relationship back on track. Let me stop here.
Thank you. And Mr. He, what
thank
do you
you.
think? Yeah.
Thank you. I think certainly we should, both China and the United States should lose no efforts to try to keep the economic cooperation going and even to improve it. However, without a sound, stable political relations, it is difficult to have a sound economic relations. So now China and United States are in a very tense situation. Maybe our two governments can never agree on a number of fundamental issues. So what's to be done? So it's, first of all, I highly recommend that China and United States seek peaceful coexistence. We just coexist peacefully. That's a UN charter, the sovereignty, equality of sovereignty. That means first, mutual respect of sovereignty and the territorial integrity. That means we will say that Hong Kong, both Hong Kong and Taiwan are part of China's territory. So you should respect. Then second, non-aggression on each other. So neither United States nor China should launch any military conflict, should seek differences solution through peaceful means. Third, non-interference of internal affairs. There are many internal affairs in China, but the United States is saying this is bad, that's bad. That's the internal affairs. So because they say that the system is bad. China's, the leader of the Communist Party of China is bad. The United States says this and that. However, this is China's internal affairs. We never care whether, we cannot interfere whether Democrats or Republicans get power, win the election, or get into the White House. And there are a number of the countries with monarchy systems. So we don't care, that's their internal affairs. So if we just base on the relation on the non-interference of the internal affairs, that would be much better. On this basis, we can seek cooperation on mutual benefit. Then on the economic front, I think there are also two fronts. First, local and the business aspect. The cooperation at this level has been going on fundamentally uninterrupted. For instance, during the first 7 months of this year, the US business investment in China set up 860 new enterprises in China over 7 months of this year. So at the same time, although White House has been pressing hard decoupling, however, the business is doing just the opposite. And on the government front, we should seek, I quite agree with Dr. Huang that we should seek dialogue instead of confrontation. Because China and the United States, our two governments had very matured dialogue mechanism. In the past years, we had over 70 different groups for dialogue, managing differences and seek cooperation. We should resume that. Regarding the technology transfer and concern about the security, we should talk about the focus on that first to clear the obstacles. Important way is we seek for conclusion of bilateral investment treaty or agreement that will formulate the basic principles, guidelines, and measures regarding all these issues. And as far as the trade is concerned, I highly recommend that the United States call out additional tariffs on China, and then China will call out the tariffs on the US products, because we see that during the past 3 years, tariffs actually have not been that effective in checking China's export to the US. However, the US importers, taxpayers paid money. That would not be good. Then on the China side, we should work hard to open the market, to welcome the US investors, to open the financial sector, and to make sure that all the players, be it SOEs, private or foreign, play on the level field and enjoy the same national treatment. They have to provide a fair environment. So that will encourage the cooperation between the two countries.
Thank you. I think I just have one little question supplementary on that one for each of you. For Dr. Huang, when you were discussing the different interest groups here in the United States, perhaps from a Chinese perspective, you didn't actually mention organized labor, which had its own concerns about trade with China, and which may be, you know, if Biden does get elected, may be stronger. What can you say about the role of organized labor as an interest group in this country?
Helena, I think you've mentioned a very important issue, because there is a general perception in the U.S. That the relationship with China has not been good for American workers, that their incomes have not been increasing, that unemployment for the wage-dependent workers in America have suffered, and China's growing rapidly and generating trade surplus is part of the cause of this. I have basically several observations as an economist. That is that the decline in manufacturing jobs in the U.S. Has been going on for 50 years, long before China became a major economic power, and it will continue. So now we have in the U.S. 90% of the US workers are in services. Only 9% are in manufacturing. Okay. So this concept of dependency upon manufacturing in the relationship to China is actually not really relevant anymore. The major impact upon the decline in manufacturing workers in the US is from innovation, not from trade with China. And we see this happening also in China. China today is more dependent upon services than manufacturing. China is actually losing more manufacturing jobs every year than the US is, because Chinese workers are moving into services. And that's the same situation. As economies get richer, their workers go into services, they leave manufacturing. So we have this view in the US of industrial jobs, particularly in the Midwest. We see potentially China as the cause. It's not actually the cause at all. The cause is that as you get richer, manufacturing jobs pay less. You go into services. You ask our people when they get out of college, do they want to work in a factory, or they want to be an engineer actually anymore? No, they want to be in finance. They want to be lawyers. They want to be accountants. They want to be in entertainment, social, journalism. They don't want to be manufacturing. That's the way it is. Why? Part of the reason is they don't pay very well. So what can the US do about this actually? And the answer, of course, is you have to have basically social programs that cushion this. This is not a China issue, it's an American issue. But nevertheless, there's the association of this. Let me just also end by saying, at one point, the argument was that how can American workers compete with Chinese workers? And their pay was so much lower. And the point I would also then make is Chinese wages have gone up 700% in the last 10 years. They're no longer actually cheap, actually, okay? It's those so-called labor-intensive jobs, which America is losing, they're not actually going to China. They're going to India, they're going to Vietnam, they're going to Mexico, actually. So this is a broader issue, but it's increasingly not a China issue. It's a different kind of concern. And for here in the United States, it's talking about retraining. It's talking about cushioning. It's also trying to move people into better jobs rather than thinking and saying it's a China issue. And it really is, increasingly is not a China issue.
Thank you so much for that clarification. I thought that was really helpful. Mr. He, you were talking in your answer there about calling out tariffs. Were you talking about, what we would say, canceling the tariffs or reducing them? What do you think should happen with tariffs?
I think first of all, in principle, the additional tariffs imposed by the Trump administration unilaterally should be removed because it's against the WTO rules. Although the USTR just launched a suit to the appellate body at the WTO just recently. We shall wait and we'll continue to work on that. That would be not good. But in the actual process, we should do it step by step. So the United States should promise to call off all the duties and the tariffs, and then China would respond to the concerns of the U.S. business companies and the government. We should do it step by step. And phase one is one step toward in this direction. However, phase one did not solve that much because all the tariffs already in place was not moved. So we should work towards that direction. We should work out that without the additional tariffs, can we find a better solution benefiting both our businesses? Certainly we can. Yeah.
Well, thank you both very much. It's been such a pleasure to be with you here in Washington, D.C. It's the late evening. In China, it's tomorrow morning. But it's been just a great experience for me being with you both for this rich and timely discussion. I want to thank you both for sharing your insights. I'm afraid that this wraps up the second session of our US-China public dialogue. My board colleagues at Just World Educational and I are delighted that through this joint project, we can demonstrate to publics in the United States, China, and elsewhere that reasoned discussion of tricky issues in the China-US relationship is still very possible, and also to contribute perhaps through our discussions to laying out some fruitful pathways for further cooperation over the months ahead. Please remember that you can find out the latest news of what's happening with our project at the US-China resource page on our website, www.justworldeducational.org. So now I want to thank our two guests for the wonderful contributions you both made to today's globe-girdling discussion. Mr. He Weiwen, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure, thank you.
And please thank your colleagues at the Chongyang Institute for the great cooperation that they've shown working with us on this. And now Dr. Yukon Huang from here in Washington, D.C., across town, I guess. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure. Enjoyed this immensely.
And I would also like to say a big thank you to all of our viewers and listeners. For Just World Educational here in Washington, D.C., this is me, Helena Cobban, saying goodbye and see you again soon. Keep checking back at our website for details of our upcoming programs.